There's not a doctrine for it.
Yeah. We'll be talking today about Tecumseh, obviously, Andy Jackson, and the Creek Native Americans who lived just 2 hours south and west at one time, Civil War within the Creek ranks, American War with Britain, an American War against Tecumseh and the Shawnee people, all of which kind of revolve around this idea of what we call a War of 1812. And we'll ask ourselves the question, we've established this brand new democratic republic, but whose republic is it going to be? So, first a little context. And a discussion briefly of the causes of a second war with Britain. You remember last time we talked about the two political parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Democratic Republicans tended to be pro-France in their foreign policy. Federalists tended to be pro-British, wanting to promote trade with Britain and new friendly relations with the old mother country. But on the high seas, there were issues with both, meaning American merchant ships were getting harassed, and that reaches a sort of a point of no return in regards to British harassment of American merchant ships in 1812. The British, far more than the French, and almost the French were not doing it by this point themselves, but the British Navy was stopping American merchant vessels, trade vessels in the sea, in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, and searching them for any kind of war materials that the U.S. government might be sending over to France. And why is this happening? Why would there be this possibility of America sending war materials to France in 1812? Well, one, you remember France bailed America out in the Revolution. So there's a thinking that pro-France elements in the American government who have had the presidency under Jefferson for 8 years. Who becomes president after Jefferson?
Andrew Jackson.
Not there yet.
Jefferson.
James Madison.
After Jefferson.
James Madison.
Madison. Yeah. His fellow Virginian, and so he's a Democratic Republican as well. And so there's thinking in the British government that the American government might be sending weapons to France, but why weapons at this time? What is the European context? By this time, France is ruled over by a military dictator who I mentioned, I think, last time, Napoleon Bonaparte, who has set himself up as the emperor of France and has built a massive army, the likes of which Europe had never seen, and is at war with other European nations for control of the European continent, and perhaps for the spoils of colonies belonging to those other European nations. So the upshot is Britain is at war with France. British government thinks America is helping France. British Navy is harassing American ships, searching them for war materials, but more. When the colonies were still colonies, at times of war, His Majesty's Navy could take sailors on merchant ships and say, "We need you in the Navy. You're hereby pressed into service of His Majesty the King." But the difference here is we're not talking about colonies anymore. America's an independent country, and yet this is still happening. When those Navy ships for the British stop American merchant ships, not only are they searching them for war materials that they might steal, they're also taking people and pressing them into service of the British Navy with the false accusation that, "Oh, I know you're a deserter from the Navy. You're a British subject who left the ship and ran away on shore somewhere, and we're pressing you back into service." Essentially, they're being kidnapped and forced to serve in the British Navy, and they're American citizens. This process of impressment is a humiliation to the young nation that is America. And it was a problem during Jefferson's administration, and is a problem that James Madison, when he becomes president himself, will inherit. Jefferson had attempted to get at this by throwing economic sanctions on the British. Yeah, an embargo, saying, well, we were going to do, what we did during the days of protest, and we'll forbid the importation of certain British goods and forbid the exportation of certain American goods to you. Nations still use economic sanctions, like Russia is being hit with massive sanctions right now because of the war in Ukraine. But the point here is that it didn't work. And by the time Madison becomes president, they're still doing it. And members of Congress, including in Madison's own Democratic-Republican Party, are saying we have to do something to defend America's honor and reputation. Think about what Jefferson wrote in the Declaration. We're supposed to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station. And it doesn't look very equal when we're being humiliated by having our citizens kidnapped and forced to serve in a foreign country's navy. The most vocal of those critics become known as the war hawks, whose thinking is the only solution to this is to fight a second war against Britain to force them to stop. But there's a secondary motivation. So this is a map of the United States circa 1812. So a few things have happened here. Remember when the 7 Years' War was over and Pontiac's Rebellion was put down, and Britain drew the line, the proclamation line, and said, you can't settle west of here because you're going to start Indian wars and that costs too much money. When the revolution is won, that line disappears, and then colonists do begin to cross the Appalachian Mountains and settle. And we have a new pattern of settlement whereby you can create territories, forcing Native Americans out, and then establish those territories eventually to petition to join the United States as new states. So that was the pattern established by the Northwest Ordinance here and by expansion of settlement in the Deep South here. You've also purchased the Louisiana Territory, not settled yet. Most of these Native Americans still control that. But what's up here? Canada. Canada is still controlled by the British. Here in these territories, still a lot of Indians living there, like Tecumseh and the Shawnee people here. They have a very good trade relationship with British traders. What do you think they get from those British traders? They're selling them deer, or trading to them things like deer skins, but what do they get in return? Guns. And what do they do with those guns? They shoot and kill Americans who are coming and settling in these territories and trying to make them states, right? So for these war hawks, a war with Britain would be a very good way to also go to war with Britain's Indian allies in the United States. Make sense? For the war hawks, a war with Britain would be a good way to stop, look at this cartoon, Indians from getting guns from Britain that they then use to kill Americans, who in their view were of course encroaching on their land, but in the view of the U.S. government are lawfully settling in American territories. You got me?
Wait, set up.
Alright, so check out the cartoon. You have an American here. He's been killed and scalped by Indians, who then turn around and give his scalp to a British soldier. In the American view of these war hawks, Native Americans in areas in the American territory where America is trying to expand and push Indians out and basically take their land. In their view, these Indians are getting guns from the British in Canada and then using them to shoot and kill Americans. And he wanted to put a stop to that. And one way to do that was say, we're going to go to war with Britain. Number one reason is impressment, but at the same time, that's a handy excuse to then also stop the British from selling guns to the Indians. And so the war hawks prevail in 1812, and war is declared. Questions? I'm going to zero in again. Look at how settlement has proceeded. There was some question over how this would work, and then the Congress passed a Northwest Ordinance that said we can. This land belongs essentially to the federal government. If you'll remember in the colonial lecture, there was a time when like the colony of Virginia claimed all of this land. That's why Washington went over into the Ohio country and inadvertently started the 7 Years' War to lay claim to that area. Northwest Ordinance abolished that notion and said, no, these western lands belong to the federal government. We'll sell them to speculators and the government will get revenue. And those speculators will parcel out the land and sell it to individual settlers. The problem is the land is still Native American land. You know, for centuries past, people like the Shawnee have lived and farmed and hunted in this region, or the Ohios and the Ojibways of the Sac and Fox. And so for these places to become first territories, and then when you have control and enough settlers to petition and become new states like Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee had, you would have to subdue Native Americans or otherwise push them out of the area. I'm going to zero right in on this area here, which is the Indiana Territory, just south of Lake Michigan in the Great Lakes region, what we now call the Midwest, what we could call back then the Ohio country. Called the Ohio country because the Ohio River flows through there and eventually into the Mississippi. By 1812, Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief living in the Ohio country, had seen in his lifetime a great population shift. When he was a young man, his father and older brothers fought with the British in the American Revolution against the colonists. Since that time, he himself had resisted white settlement in Shawnee lands, including using firearms provided by British traders to kill American settlers encroaching on Shawnee lands. But by 1812, he now knew that he and his people were outnumbered by white Americans. And he had seen portions of Shawnee hunting land ceded away with a C-E-D-E-D. That is, there had been numerous cases of land cessions, meaning chiefs of the Shawnee tribe or people had signed away chunks of their land to the United States. Every one of those little colored areas there represents a portion of Shawnee or some other Native American land that had been ceded or signed over to the American government in 1795, 1805, 1807, 1809, 1803, 1804. Shawnee land is dwindling. How could this be? Why was this happening? Number one, there was no single paramount chief of the Shawnee people. There were multiple chiefs and there was no singular one ruler. And so 2 or 3 chiefs over here could sign away this big chunk of land, and somebody like Tecumseh way over here can't do much about it but complain and be upset. Why were those other chiefs doing this, though? If you look at historical documents from the Jefferson administration, you can see that Jefferson writes a letter to the man who was at the time the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison. And he says, this is our policy for the Native Americans in your territory that are refusing to move or whatever. Let them know that we have whatever trade goods short of firearms that they want or need. Encourage your Indian agents, these were representatives of the American government living in or near Indian territory. Tell your Indian agents to engage in a robust trade with these people for things like deer skins that we know are going to dwindle. The population of those are going to dwindle. And or we're going to give them way more shit than they can possibly meet in value with deer skins. And at the end of a given year, our Indian agents are going to sit down with their chiefs and go, man, I'm looking at my balance sheet here, and we've given you X amount in goods, manufactured goods. You guys only gave us this much in deer skins. There's a trade imbalance here. There's a debt that you owe. Let's think about what you can do to satisfy that debt. You could sign away a portion of your land, and we'll call it even. Jefferson, the president, is outright telling them to make this happen. Make it so that they owe us in terms of trade, and then tell them the best and easiest way to satisfy that debt is just to sell us some land.
Was this Jefferson or Madison?
This was Jefferson. Yeah, this was in the years leading up to 1812. And that's why you had seen those many land cessions represented by those different chunks and different colors in that map. Tecumseh and others are enraged by this.
Okay, wait, so Jefferson wanted them to trade land in order to repay their debt where they were giving them deer skin and stuff like that?
Yep. So that's the thing. He would say, look, we can manufacture goods till we're blue in the face. There's only so many deer out there. And we feel like their desire for the manufactured goods we can trade to them will outstrip the amount of deer that they can kill and skin. And that at the end of the year, eventually, as the deer population dwindles, they're not going to be able to match what we give them if we're really aggressive about it. And we'll tell them, hey, you're out of deer skins. You don't have enough to pay us back. What's the next best thing we want? And what's the thing they really wanted to begin with? Land, right?
Oh, I was pretty much just about to ask that. I was going to say, so pretty much the government knew they wanted the land, and they just played them to get
Yeah, they deliberately developed trade imbalance or trade imbalances where there would be debt owed by Native American leaders to the United States government, and that they would then encourage land cessions or the sale of land to satisfy the debt, right? Does that make sense? For Tecumseh, this is appalling for a number of reasons. Not only would he ask, where does this stop or where does this end? And the logical answer for him is eventually there's not going to be any land left to give. Number two, for him, in the Shawnee way of thinking and that of many other Native Americans, land was not something to be bought or sold or even owned in the first place. They did not have the concept of the individual ownership of land. You remember I told you one of the key features of Native American societies was communal living in a village, a communal farm belonging to the people, and then hunting lands all around that were owned, or not even owned, that were shared collectively by all the people. You didn't have this plot of land that belonged to so-and-so, and this plot of land that belonged to so-and-so. It was an alien concept. Tecumseh would say, to say that you're selling the land is like trying to say you're selling the air or the water in the ocean. Not to mention, this is an existential threat to our civilization. There's something else. Those Indian agents, the representatives of the American government that worked with these Native American leaders, were encouraging the adoption of the U.S. Plan of Civilization. The Plan of Civilization was a plan to quote-unquote civilize Native Americans, which is to say to make them socially and culturally like us. What did that involve? Well, first of all, it involved adopting the concept of individual ownership of land as opposed to communal or shared land. It involved encouraging men to take up farming and the rearing of livestock. What I told you about Native American society before, you will probably remember, is that farming was women's work. And you're asking men to stop going out on the hunt and to settle down in individual family farms and take up women's work, along with the raising livestock part, which was something Native American societies hadn't done because there were not cattle or hogs or those kind of animals here prior to the arrival of Europeans. And then what do they want the women to do? To get out of the fields and then to go into the home and to be a domestic housewife and to do spinning and weaving in the home, something that they had never done. So you're asking for significant change in gender roles in Native American societies. You're asking them to abandon communal living, and by the way, most Native American societies were matrilineal as opposed to patrilineal. Pater as in father, mater as in mother. Meaning a young man would marry and would typically go and live with his wife's family. And the lineage by way of the woman, the wife, the daughter, was the one that mattered the most. And you're asking them to abandon all of that and to adopt a very paternalistic society or way of living that was Anglo-American. Such was the U.S. plan of civilization, an attempt to encourage Native Americans to abandon their own ways of life and to adopt American ways of life. In other words, to get them to finally one that works, to assimilate to American culture and social norms. Tecumseh is appalled by this as well and will seek to encourage other chiefs to hold fast to the old ways, to hold on to our way of living and our society and culture, and to try to revive that even, and also to build a pan-Indian confederacy. When you see pan as a prefix like this, it means united. He wanted to bring together not only the Shawnee people, but all neighboring Native Americans that he could under his own leadership, and to form essentially an army that could stand up to American encroachment. They could not only resist the plan of civilization, but could resist these land cessions and hold on to the land that you had and stop these Americans from coming and settling in your lands and pushing you off. In his way of thinking, by that time, due to the population shift and the changes that had taken place in his lifetime, the Shawnee could not do it themselves. But if they stood together with other Native Americans, perhaps they could. Of course, with the help of the British. His brother is Tenskwatawa, who becomes known as the Shawnee Prophet. Like many Native Americans, and who, by the way, did not have alcohol prior to the arrival of Europeans, and Europeans very often would attempt to ply Native Americans with alcohol, get them drunk, and then make deals with them. Given that, and given the despair of losing your way of life and your civilization, a lot of Native Americans became alcoholics, as did Tenskwatawa. But he has a moment of clarity, and he gets sober, and he has a vision. The Shawnee master of life, a godlike figure who tells, supposedly, Tenskwatawa that if the red people, the red-skinned people, Native Americans, could come together and unite across tribal and historical lines, that the children of the evil serpent could be destroyed, meaning white people. So he tells the Shawnee and anyone else who will listen, this is the vision he has had, and they come to view him in this way as a prophet. And he essentially adds then a religious component to his brother's more sort of political message. That this is, not only is my brother advocating for this in terms of our own survival vis-a-vis land cessions and the plan of civilization, but I'm telling you that it has been ordained by the master of life that this is what he must do. And so they, in essence, become brotherly recruiters for this pan-Indian confederacy to stand up to white encroachment in the plan of civilization. Harrison knows this. Harrison is, again, the governor of Indiana Territory, which, obviously, this is one of those misleading maps, because it makes it look like this is a nice, tidy little territory that is fully governed by an American governor with American settlers there. No, it's still, a large chunk of that was still controlled by the Shawnee. But Harrison knows what Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa are up to, and remember what he had been told to do by Jefferson in years prior to encourage those land cessions by way of getting them in debt. They knew that that would divide the chiefs. They knew that if they secured a land cession from 2 or 3 chiefs over here, they would alienate and piss off 2 or 3 other chiefs like Tecumseh over here. Divide and conquer had been the strategy. Here is Tecumseh trying to do the exact opposite of divide and conquer, and to unite people, not only among the Shawnee, but any and other Native Americans who would listen. And so at one point, Tecumseh decides to leave the Ohio country and come down here to recruit the Creek Indians. While he is gone, Harrison takes the territorial militia of Indiana and attacks Tenskwatawa at a place called Prophetstown, or nearby a place called Tippecanoe. And a battle there will be the beginning of an American war against Tecumseh's Pan-Indian Confederacy, which, as you know, is aligned with, or has friendly relations with British traders in Canada. And this happens more or less around the same time of America declaring war on Britain because of impressment. You with me thus far? Yes.
So, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, sorry, they're brothers?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the first battle is when he came down to get the Creeks?
Yeah, Tecumseh is away, and Harrison's thinking was the great leader is away, his brother's in charge, maybe not as effective as a military leader. I'll strike while the iron is hot, so to speak, and maybe it'll be a decisive victory. It was a tactical victory, but not a decisive one. Essentially what happens is Tecumseh will hurry back. He and his brother and the Pan-Indian Confederacy that he has been able to build will essentially move up into Canada to try and fight alongside British forces.
So the battle was in Indiana, not where the
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Although we're about to find out what happens when Tecumseh comes down here.
Okay.
That's a part of it too. Yeah, Tippecanoe / Provincetown is right here in the sort of middle of it all. Right there, the Tippecanoe River that runs right through Provincetown. Provincetown being named for Tenskwatawa, the prophet.
My dog is actually named after Tippecanoe.
That's awesome.
Her name is Tippy now.
Fantastic. And so you probably know then, was it Taylor or Tyler? Tippecanoe and Tyler, it was whoever Tyler was the VP. Later, one of the generals, Harrison, obviously. Yeah, you know Harrison's name because he would later become president. And John Tyler was his running mate, and his slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Like, I fought the battle against the terrible Indians and won. So what about when Tecumseh comes down here? Now, let me try. I keep meaning to put this in there. Let me try this. That's the one. Creek country. That is the area of not just creek villages along major rivers, kind of just 2 hours west in what's now the state of Alabama, but also ancestral creek hunting lands used to stretch all the way to the Savannah River. And as you can see over time, there were land cessions. First, the signing away of lands all the way to the Ocmulgee River that runs through Macon. And then eventually the signing away of still more and more lands and the dwindling of that land once being the home of the Creek Nation, the ancestral hunting lands. So they find themselves, the Creeks, in the same position as were the Shawnee at that time. They were also having the plan of civilization foisted on them, forced on them by American Indian agents who had gone into the heart of Creek country along the Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers, and again, what's today northeastern and central Alabama, via a federal road that ran out of Georgia into East Alabama. And so they had seen the same thing, but one factor here is that quite a few of Creek leaders had adopted the plan of civilization. They had taken up individual land ownership. They had taken up farming and raising livestock. They had adopted certain American or Anglo-American cultural ways, and some of them had become quite wealthy and successful in doing so. These become known as the collaborating Creeks, including that guy there, is William McIntosh. Why does this Creek man have a Scottish name? Because, like many of his brethren, he was the offspring of a Creek woman and a Scottish trader operating in the area. And remember, matrilineal society, he stayed and was raised by his mother in Creek country, but with his father's name. And so he was a natural fit to become one of these collaborating Creeks and to take up the U.S. plan of civilization, do everything the American government was encouraging you to do. But there were a great many people among the Creeks who, like Tecumseh, were disgusted by this and fed up with the land cessions. They become known, a group of them become known as the Red Stick faction. The Red Stick faction are Creeks who are disgusted by the plan of civilization and those who adopted it, fed up with the many decades of land cessions, who were more or less in the same mode of thinking as were Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, just in a different part of the country. So they were a natural fit to join Tecumseh's Pan-Indian Confederacy. The problem is they have such a large number within their own society of people who are these collaborating, or what become known as the white faction Creeks, who are going along with the plan of civilization and who are assimilating. And so what Tecumseh wanders into is a civil war within Creek country that will become known as the Red Stick War. But he has to turn around and go back because of the attack of Prophetstown. So he kind of comes down, encourages these young Red Stick warriors, perhaps accelerates the outbreak of this civil war among the Creeks, but has to return home. So how does a Creek Civil War become an American war on the Red Stick Creeks? I'll walk you through this. I'm not going to expect you to give me this chain of events back, but I do want to kind of walk through it. So there's a key difference here with the position that the Red Stick Creeks are in and the position that Tecumseh was in before he left. Remember, who are Tecumseh and the Shawnee getting their weapons from? The British in Canada. There is no British Canada down here. So what would the Red Sticks do if they were to try to attempt to get weapons of their own to build an army? At that time, the Gulf Coast was still claimed and to an extent controlled by the Spanish. Florida and what is now coastal Alabama and coastal Mississippi were Spanish colony at that time. The Spanish didn't have a whole lot of presence in the region. Over here on the Atlantic coast, they had St. Augustine, and here they had Pensacola, and they had Mobile. And it's mostly traders and Catholic missionaries, but traders is what you wanted. So at one point, a group of Red Stick warriors leaves the heart of Creek country and moves south to go to Pensacola to try to get guns from the Spanish. The territorial governor of what was then the Mississippi Territory, including what's now Alabama, knew what they were doing and attacked them here at Burnt Corn Creek. In retaliation for that attack, the Red Stick warriors turned and attacked a fort here on the Alabama River called Fort Mims and killed several people, including American citizens who were holed up in that fort. Not just collaborating Creeks, but American citizens. And that becomes a pretext for the United States government to say, we're now at war with you. They send down from Tennessee the leader of the Tennessee State Militia, Andrew Jackson, with a large military force that will include his state militia from Tennessee, the cooperating Mississippi Territorial Militia, elements of the regular United States Army, and Cherokee mercenaries from northwest Georgia, who were longtime enemies of the Creeks, from just north of where we are, who Jackson pays to come and fight along with him. So it will be a war that is very much one-sided in terms of military force and resources, but remarkably lasts for over a year in a number of different battles, but regrettably for the Red Stick Creeks, culminates in the decisive Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Horseshoe Bend in the Tallapoosa River here that you can see, well, it looks like a horseshoe, where the Red Sticks had taken up in a town they called Tohopeka right here, thinking that the river provided a natural boundary defense to their south, and that they simply needed to fortify this narrow strip of land here that they could defend against Jackson's attacks. But what Jackson did is take overwhelming force to attack that line, the defensive line, but also to station his Cherokee mercenaries on the other side of the river, so that when they broke through and the Red Sticks tried to flee across the river, they were systematically shot down by the Cherokee as they tried to get away. So it becomes a massacre that is a decisive defeat for the Red Sticks. Jackson then settles down in a fort that they built named for him and signs a treaty with the collaborating white Creeks, the ones that were his allies in this internal Creek Civil War, and then tells them, we just solved your problem. We came down here and settled this uprising of your angry red stick young people. You owe us. And what do you think he wants for that debt?
Couldn't be late.
Yeah, right. Possibly, yeah. So the Treaty of Fort Jackson forces the collaborating Creeks to then sign away this big dark red chunk of land. And the Creeks will basically at that point be left with only the core areas of their village settlements in and around the Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers. So they viewed that, of course, as a massive betrayal, and perhaps rightly so. Questions? Now, we know this is War of 1812, which encompasses this Red Stick War, which encompasses a war against Tecumseh and his Pan-Indian Confederacy, also involves a war with Britain, about which we have said nothing yet. So let us say that now. At the onset of the war, the United States invaded southeastern Canada and actually won some battles and took control of significant portions of territory, including some of the cities in that region. Tecumseh, I told you, takes his force and his brother and moves north into Canada to fight directly alongside the British in those battles. The British response was, of course, to attempt to defend Canada, their colony, but also to simultaneously invade Chesapeake Bay here and to attack first the nation's brand new capital that you know had been built right there in the south per the terms of the Compromise of 1790, the room where it happened. The brand new U.S. Capitol is burned, part of it, to the ground. American troops are unable to defend Washington, D.C. from a British attack. The president, members of Congress all have to flee the city. A great humiliation. So America's having success in Canada, but didn't dedicate enough defensive troops to its own capital. But rather than simply occupy the capital, though, British troops moved north. And the next city to the north, at the top of Chesapeake Bay, was Baltimore, Maryland. And the British attempted to attack Baltimore not simply by land, but also by sea. Baltimore is a harbor town. And like many harbor towns that are built in a naturally defensive position, it had forts guarding the entrance to that harbor. So if you will indulge me here momentarily, there's Washington, there's Baltimore today. They're basically the same metropolitan area. But the heart of Baltimore Harbor is here. And so you have forts here and here that could fire exploding shells at any ships that would try to get in, while troops are trying to approach from the south. So these forts would be key in defense. And so you've got Fort Armistead there, Fort Carroll there. Where is, why is the name of the main one escaping me? No, nobody with an assist?
Who?
Fort, no, that's completely unhelpful. Well, as you can see, there's quite a few of them. McHenry, thank you, goodness gracious. There's one of the inner forts here, McHenry. So it becomes a land and sea-based battle where British ships are trying to attack these forts. Those forts have cannons who are firing on those ships. At that time, or by that time, you not only had artillery or cannons that shot cannonballs, but they had exploding shells that would blow up and do massive damage to ships, to forts, to structures, to soldiers. And even at that time, they had experimented with some like rocket-like things that would deploy those exploding shells as well. And so while this battle is raging, there's an American who had been taken prisoner by the British at one point and was in the hold of a British ship out in the harbor. You can see out the porthole through the night, the battle raging and the bombs bursting in air, if you will, and the rockets red glare. And when the morning sun rises, lo and behold, the American flag, or the Star-Spangled Banner, still waved over Fort McHenry in the city of Baltimore. And so Francis Scott Key writes a poem about that later becomes our national anthem. And the point for our purposes being America wins the Battle of Baltimore. They had not been able to defend Washington, D.C., but they did successfully stand up to a British attempt to take then the city of Baltimore. The British response at that point was to say, all right, we'll take the war even farther south, a strategy which had failed during the Revolution. But even farther south than that, why don't we send a massive fleet down here and invade New Orleans, or invade Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, try to take the strategic city of New Orleans, which is at the mouth of the Mississippi River, which is the heart of the American sort of heartland even still today. So if you could take that city, you would have a massive impact on American trade and so on. It would be huge. But when those troops arrive and are deployed there and march on New Orleans, might there be at that moment an individual with a very large army that is sitting around with nothing to do in 1814? Well, here's New Orleans. Look at that. Fort Jackson, where sits Andy Jackson and his army, having defeated the Red Stick Creeks. They are deployed to defend New Orleans from the British, which they do. Jackson wins a more traditional pitched field battle, not involving Britain's powerful navy, but its powerful army, and it is a victory for Jackson. There's a great irony to this, though, in that the war was already over. Unbeknownst to Jackson or his British counterpart, British and American diplomats in Belgium, in the city of Ghent, had already signed a treaty negotiating an end to the war, but word had not yet gotten back across the Atlantic Ocean and down to New Orleans to inform either of them of this fact. And so the battle had no impact on the terms of peace, and the greatest significance then of it is that it makes a national hero out of Andy Jackson. He then becomes known as the guy who went down and whipped the Red Stick Creeks, and then the guy who went toe-to-toe with the big bad British army and won. And he's going to use that fame to build a political career on. Now, what about the terms of this treaty? Who are the big winners and losers? It's really...
America won.
Well, to an extent, yes. It's almost, though, an establishment of what they call the status quo antebellum. Antebellum means before the war. Status quo, the way it was. Now, the British do agree to stop impressment. That was the biggest thing. But why not? Because if you know your European history, you know Napoleon had been defeated by this time. And Britain is no longer going to be at war with France. They don't need to engage in impressment anyway. Counterpart, though, America agrees to withdraw its forces from Canada, which by that time America was claiming that we had taken. And this is part of America now. We're like, all right, you stop impressment, we'll withdraw from Canada. The British agreed, this is probably the biggest takeaway, to stop selling guns to the Native Americans. Which means, you know, then they are the big losers in all of this. Nobody invited their representatives to the table. Tecumseh, by the way, was dead, killed in the fighting in Canada. His brother has obviously been discredited because those Indians who did come together did not, in fact, even contribute to a victory over the Americans, much less destroy the children of the evil serpent. What else can we say about winner? I mean, the big winner of it all is Jackson himself, who, as I said, his exploits in this war gain him the kind of fame that will allow him to build a political career that will see him, create his very own political party. And I think that's where we're going now. Questions? So Jackson was a child of immigrants, Scots-Irish immigrants from the north of Ireland, the British portion of Ireland, who end up settling in what was then the territory of Tennessee. Very humble beginnings, in other words. Actually, at one point during the Revolution, as a very young man, I mean a boy really, was briefly held captive by the British, but who after the war settles there in what would become soon the state of Tennessee. He's a saddle maker by trade, living out in the countryside, growing up on a farm, having a farm of his own. Teaches himself law, though, and becomes a sort of country lawyer, working on issues of land sales or land disputes. And eventually becomes an officer in the state militia of Tennessee, and by 1812, the commanding officer of the militia of the state of Tennessee, who would be asked to go into Creek country / Mississippi territory and help subdue the Red State. And then who defeats the British in the Battle of New Orleans, who thereby becomes a national hero. After the War of 1812 was over, remember, Florida at that time was claimed, or to an extent controlled, by Florida. Only outside of those places I just mentioned, St. Augustine, Mobile, Pensacola, they didn't really control it. The interior of Florida was Native American country. And there were communities in that Native American country that were very welcoming to runaway slaves. Enslaved persons from places like Georgia or South Carolina who could run away and escape and get into Spanish Florida could take up residence with and live in harmony with Native Americans there. Slave owners knew this. They didn't like it. They wanted the Spanish government to do something about it. The Spanish government didn't do anything about it. And so America takes the gamble at one point that they could send their own military forces into Florida to subdue these Native Americans who were essentially encouraging enslaved people in the South to run away and to join them. That included the peoples who had become known as the Seminoles. The Seminoles are in essence refugee Creeks who over time had left Creek country and settled in Florida, including the Seminole leader Osceola, who is from the town of Tallahassee in Alabama.
Yeah. The Seminole also had never like an actual war, but whenever they were put on reservations together with the Creek, there was a lot of conflict, and the Creeks would actively try to enslave Seminole people. Yeah.
I actually didn't know that. I guess in some ways that's not surprising to me.
They were refugees. They were not refugees of the Creeks. They were refugees from.
Yeah. So, but this would be when they ended up in Oklahoma, even. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So, the American government at one point sends Jackson, who's still a general, with an American military force into Spanish Florida to subdue the Seminoles to try to stop this problem of runaway slaves seeking their freedom down in Florida. And this was the first of what would become known as the Seminole Wars. The Seminoles continued to fight for decades and to migrate further and further south into what was then, I mean, most of central and south Florida was lakes and swamps. There was no city of Miami or any of that yet. And so they end up fleeing down into the swamps of South Florida, the Everglades.
Who were the Seminoles again?
They were refugee Creeks who over time, for either reasons of conflict or reasons of avoiding American encroachment, had over time settled in Spanish Florida.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The conflict mostly came after the Creeks and Seminoles were put back together.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. So that helps Jackson grow his sort of star power, is the point. It's like, here's a guy, and think about this in terms of the sort of racist American mindset at the time. Here's an Indian killer who also killed a bunch of British and successfully defended New Orleans. He is able to use that fame to start his own political party outside of the Federalists and Democratic Republicans that he calls just the Democracy, which would come to be known as the Democratic Party. And this is the Democratic Party that still exists. For Jackson, at the heart of this Democratic Party would be going in even harder on that Jeffersonian concept of the yeoman farmer as the heart of America. For Jackson, that included even like the poor white farmer. And he claims to be the champion of just the average farming American, just the average Joe farmer. And the big difference between him and Jefferson in positioning themselves as kind of the man of the people, of the common man, is that unlike Jefferson, Jackson had actually been the common man. He's the first American president to have those humble beginnings, with all the previous presidents being born into pretty considerable wealth. So he begins calling for universal suffrage. What does the suffrage mean? Well, right to vote. The suffrage of the franchise is a way of referring to our right to vote. At that time, most states still had restrictions on voting that said you normally have to be a man, you have to own a certain amount of property. And Jackson favored abolishing those limitations and opening it up for not really universal suffrage, because that would include, women, people of color.
This movement is usually referred to as universal male suffrage whenever it pops up.
Yep, universal WM, white male suffrage. Opening up the right to vote to all white men, no matter of their wealth or property ownership or whatever. He also positions his party as a champion of states' rights and states' power versus the federal government. And he will oppose any expansion, or even, as we'll see, previous expansions of federal power. So he inherits the old anti-federalist mantle that had been inherited by the Democratic, Republican, or Jeffersonian party, and then builds that into his own Democratic party. Also among the planks of the Democratic Party's platform, clearing and settling the interior. Clearing and settling the interior. First of all, what do you think the interior means, and what would be clearing and settling it? Not quite yet.
Everything between New Spain and the colonies?
Yeah, well, yes, essentially so. Everything between the Appalachian Mountains and, at this time, for now, the Mississippi River. What it means is clearing it of Indians, forcibly removing them so that white people could settle wherever they wanted in these territories without having to worry about getting shot at by the Shawnee, the Creeks, or the Choctaw, or the Chickasaw, or whomever. So forcibly removing Native Americans from the area between the mountains and the Mississippi River. Jackson is able to get elected president on this platform in 1829, and again 4 years later. So he will serve 2 terms. One of the things that remember Jackson had used Cherokee mercenaries, and those two were not friends, but the Cherokee remained in North Georgia, Northeast Alabama, Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, up in the mountains. They were among those who resisted. I mean, all 5 resisted. The Seminole, as I told you, kept fighting and retreating into the swamp. The Creeks tried to actively resist, only to be subdued by the army and forced to Oklahoma. The Cherokee took a novel approach and challenged this in court. Think about, first of all, what I just told you they called these folks, the 5 civilized tribes.
These were ones that they considered to be like allies in parts of America, technically.
They're the ones among whom many people, like the collaborating Creeks, had done everything the Americans had asked them to do. A lot of them had taken up the plan of civilization. The Cherokee said, we have done this. We've tried to assimilate. We have taken to your plan of civilization. We've adopted your language. We have an English language newspaper.
They had literally just signed a treaty saying they couldn't do specifically this like 30 years ago.
Yes, and they would point to that, and they also said, we wrote a constitution that we based on your constitution. And they pointed back to that and said, think about when the Washington administration, they treated us in signing that treaty as an independent nation. And now you're telling us we have to be uprooted and we're going to be given equal value and amount of land in Oklahoma when we really doubt if that's going to be the case.
If it was equal value, they wouldn't be taking it. They wanted all the gold.
Right. And so they filed a suit in a federal court there in Georgia that makes its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, and astonishingly, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed and ruled in their favor. But do you remember, I think I told you when we talked about Marbury versus Madison, sometimes the court can render a decision, and if either Congress or the executive branch, the president, don't seek to enforce the decision, it doesn't matter. And Jackson knew this, and he says something supposedly like, well, the Chief Justice has made his opinion, let's see him enforce it. Like, what's he going to do about it? You know? And so, in blatant disregard of the Supreme Court's decision, the Cherokee are forcibly removed to Oklahoma along with everybody else.
Knowing Jackson, that was probably a polite, that might have been a subtle invitation to duel him and get murdered.
Indeed, yeah. Jackson, I forgot to mention that Jackson had participated in several duels, including getting shot in one of them.
22 of them.
God almighty. I mean, he was in a few. I didn't know.
He was not a quick shot. He was just durable.
Yeah, he was the leader of the military, maybe not so much of a soldier himself. But in any case, for the Cherokee, their late removal after that decision involved a forced march hundreds of miles up through Tennessee and Kentucky and Illinois in the dead of winter, where it gets pretty cold, in the snow and ice, and eventually through Missouri and to Oklahoma, where of course the land was not equal in either quality, value, or amount. This becomes known in Cherokee history as the Trail of Tears. It leaves, an indelible mark through the generations on Cherokee society. And to this day, in the state of Oklahoma, there are large reservations where the descendants of these people continue to live.
Wait, where did you say he made them walk to? Like, where did the trail end?
So if you look at this map, they're the northernmost one here. And I don't remember exactly why this was the route chosen, but by the time they get up here into Illinois, it was like the dead middle of winter. A lot of people died from exposure, the conditions, starvation, having to walk hundreds of miles in the snow and ice. And so, consider that the event alone, being uprooted from your ancestral homeland and taken to an alien foreign land and forced onto a reservation would be bad enough, but when the process itself results in the deaths of hundreds of your own people, that makes it immeasurably worse.
It was never a win-win situation for them.
Yeah,
Ever.
exactly. So I want you to think though about the consequences of this. Clearing and settling the interior. Once these people are forcibly removed, that removes any barrier to the extension of white settlement into that area. Now, I alluded to, this is the final point, I alluded to earlier the Northwest Ordinance that governed the expansion into what we now call the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Michigan, or not Kentucky, I'm sorry, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, eventually Wisconsin. There was a clause in the Northwest Ordinance that governs settlement there that is not going to govern settlement down here. You want to guess what it was? Northwest Ordinance banned the expansion of slavery into that area. There is no Southwest Ordinance. And so, when white settlement expands robustly into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, slavery expands with it. People from the old slave areas of Georgia, coastal Georgia and South Carolina, the Low Country, from the Tidewater where the tobacco market was on the decline, they migrate into Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana and either bring enslaved people with them or go to places like Jackson and Mobile and Tuscaloosa and they purchase enslaved people who were sold from the older areas like the Tidewater where the market is declining. At this very moment, they realize that the soil in this region here, that we call the Black Belt because of the color of the soil, south central Georgia, south central Alabama, Mississippi, what they call the Mississippi Delta up here, that soil was ideal in the southern climate to grow long staple cotton. At the very moment that the cotton gin had been invented that allows for a much more efficient separation of cotton fiber from seed and stem, and at also the very moment that the Industrial Revolution was taking off in Britain and the northern parts of America, and cotton will replace wool as the go-to material in the textile industry. This side over here represents 1820. This side represents 1860. Up top is the slave population, which as you can see in what we now call the Deep South has exploded by 1860. that should be moved kind of down a little bit. And cotton production is on the bottom, which is very, very little here. And we'll look at it by 1860. Massive expansion in cotton production with the expansion of slavery into the Deep South. That is the upshot of all of this. So think about Jackson as this champion of democracy, but for the white man, the champion of Indian removal, which allows for a massive expansion of chattel and race-based slavery into the Deep South. Questions about any of this? All right, that's it. That's where we'll pick